Okay, you are welcome back to Cardiff, where I am joined by rugby writer and broadcaster Ross Harries for a look through the newspapers. Ross, we will get to them in just a moment, but first of all, I'm back in Llandaff once again. I was here last night chatting to people in the rugby club. The kids at the club not happy with us on Off the Ball for writing off Wales once again this year. They said, keep your opinions to yourself, and I think they called us rude, and they probably held back a little bit. I presume you hold the same view.
You've been nothing but charming so far, so I can't imagine you being rude to the good people of Llandaff. But yeah, it depends where you go in Wales, actually. Some Welsh people are, I think, pessimists by nature. And however well Wales did the previous year and the previous campaign, they'll always have doubts. I think some of those doubts are probably well-founded this time around, simply because the injury list is quite frightening. Yeah. The regions, as is often the case, come into this, or the players from the regions come into this off the back of some pretty underwhelming form, particularly in Europe. The Ospreys and the Scarlets were bottom of their respective pools. The Ospreys didn't pick up a point in any of their games, and they've supplied, I think, 8 players to the national squad. So there is this sort of understandable pessimism that how can Wales suddenly transform these underachieving regional players into championship winners. But, and this caveat is always the same, that same overall feeling of pessimism was present this time last year.
Yeah. And we know.
We had a few helping hands along the way, admittedly, not least from Peter O'Mahony in game one. But I think what Wales don't get the credit for is their discipline. There's been plenty of jokes and memes about Wales needing a player from the opposition to be sent off in order for them to win a test match. But not many people focus on the fact that Wales aren't getting players carded or sent off, which has become a big thing in the game, particularly with new way the laws are interpreted on tackle height and that kind of thing. So I think what you witnessed last night was probably just a bit of that bristling optimism that comes to the surface when game day is getting closer and closer. We all wallow in misery for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then as test weekend approaches, that kind of hoil, that passion comes to the fore, and everyone thinks we're going to win the whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I should say as well that in this area we're essentially in the shadow of Cardiff Met, which is a really interesting situation at the moment, because you did a story on them last week about how they're helping produce great rugby talent. The problem is a lot of that talent isn't coming through for Wales.
Yeah, I mean, you look back historically, it's got a long and distinguished record of producing talent for Wales. Gareth Edwards went there, so that pretty much says it all. And guys like John Devereux, Roy Bergers, lots of players have come through that pathway. Gareth Davis, who was the chairman at the WRU for so long. But yeah, the ones that have been making the headlines of late have all rocked up in an England shirt in recent weeks and months. Alex Dombrant was the poster boy of Harlequins and to a lesser extent of English rugby at the moment. Luke Northmore is the latest to be drafted in, a colleague of Dombrant's at Harlequins. There's a guy called Tom Pearson who's been tearing up trees for London Irish. He's recently graduated as well, and I think he's been training in the shadow England squad, so they clearly rate him quite highly. So, as you can expect, there have been sort of howls of outrage from the Welsh rugby public. It's like, how is a university based in the Welsh capital supplying players to the English national side? It's a bit of a misnomer because, it's a university, so there are students from all over the place there. And these guys are English. Alex Dombrant grew up in Surrey. Quins were his childhood team. He wanted to play for Quins. So it's not as though they've been sort of poached under the eyes of the Welsh selectors. But when I went there last week, there was an interesting conversation to be had about whether the Welsh Rugby Union and the regions, pay enough attention to places like Cardiff Met as a link in the supply chain, right. Or is their lens narrowed just to the academies that they fund, and they only look at the players who come through that particular pathway? And Cardiff Met's attitude was very much, it shouldn't be a competition. We shouldn't be seen as a competitive element to the regions. We should be seen as a complementary aspect. Some players develop later than others. Some players' talent doesn't come to the fore until 19, 20, 21 years of age, and that was exactly the case with Dombrant. Apparently he arrived as a slightly overweight, soft around the edges cricketer who loved cream cakes and didn't show much inclination for hard work, but within a few years he'd knocked off all those hard soft edges, and suddenly England came knocking. I think there's definitely a conversation to be had about whether enough of a light is being shone on these places.
Is that kind of indicative of Welsh rugby in general? That, I mean, not that the national team has ever been left wanting players, but because of maybe the poor form from the regions for the last few years and beyond, that there is almost, it's time for a rethink about where the talent is coming through and what exactly the Welsh Rugby Union are doing with the talent.
Yeah, it's an ongoing question, I think, and because Wales, although it's the national sport here, although football fans would argue against that, I think there's always a conversation to be had about whether we're exploiting the talent that's there enough, or whether the supply chain becomes too narrow at that critical age, where you're thinking about turning professional. I guess we always look slightly enviously over the border at England, who've got more registered professional players than any other nation on earth. They've got a bigger player pool. They've got 12, 13 Premiership sides at the moment that they can draw from. I think there's always a kind of element of, right, well, our depth isn't remotely near that. How can we expand the pool? How can we deepen that pool? And the fact is, we'll never be able to have a pool of talent that compares to England because the numbers don't stack up. But I think as a nation, it's incumbent on us to make sure we don't close off any avenues. So if there is, an 18-year-old kid who comes to Cardiff Met who's played a bit of rugby but isn't necessarily hugely dedicated about it, but during his time at university, he kind of blossoms, or she blossoms, and turns out to be someone with genuine talent, then it should be not beyond the wit of man that there are lines of communication between these institutions and the regions, the academies, and the WRU.
Bit of a no-brainer, really, isn't it? Especially, I assume the facilities in Cardiff Met are amazing as well, are they?
Phenomenal.
Right.
I spent the day there and I spoke to virtually everyone on the elite rugby team, and yeah. What was noticeable, very different from my days at university, where most of my student colleagues barely got out of bed before 11. Most of the guys on the sports programme are lifting weights at 6:30 in the morning in this state.
That's no college life.
It's not. I think I did press the S&C guy on this a little bit and said, "Come on, you've got to let them be students," and they appreciate that. It's a balance, having fun, playing sport, getting your academic degree. It's all a balance. But yeah, facilities wise. It's out of this world, and also not just the nuts and bolts, the gyms and the running tracks and whatnot, but because there are people studying different disciplines all over the university, they've got access to sports psychologists, to analysts, to coders, to massage and physiotherapy, so they kind of get the same sort of setup as you'd get at a professional club. And their head coach was joking, that some of them get accustomed to that, and if they do then drop back and play for a Maesteg Harlequins or a Bedwas in the Welsh Championship, they're not going to get that kind of stuff catered for there. So kind of enjoy it while you can.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like an absolutely amazing facility that the WRU need to be tapping into. Just looking at some of the papers here, disgraceful stories on the front of the Western Mail and the South Wales Echo. Stadium bars to close early in Six Nations is this morning's headline on the Western Mail. We'll come back to yesterday's Echo preview, and this morning's South Wales Echo is Welsh Rugby, new dry half. And I'm not sure, are you going to go to a game ever again, Ross? I mean, the alcohol percentage has been dropped from 5% to 4.3%. This is a disgrace.
Big news. It was a huge story last night, all over the Welsh news. It's been coming. I think the WRO have experimented with a couple of other solutions. There was a sort of no alcohol family zone, I think during the 2020 Six Nations. Not sure how successful that was proved to be. But there has been this kind of growing concern that the stadium's becoming an unpleasant place to go for a lot of hardcore rugby fans. There's always been this divide, between the hardcore rugby fan and the event goer. And there are some, I think it's a minority, but some more snobbish Welsh fans who don't like the daffodil hats and the leeks pinned to the lapel, and the people who turn up once a year to watch Wales and the Six Nations, who don't go and watch their club or the regions. I've got no issue with that. That's what makes the stadium the size and the colourful atmospheric place it is. And without those people, you get half full, quarter full stadiums. So I think there's a place for everyone there. I'm not particularly snobbish about that. But as I say, there has been this growing concern that more drunk people are going and people aren't paying attention to the game. They're just getting hammered. and occasional fights break out, and occasional arguments break out. And there was that awful story in the autumn about a child that was vomited on by a drunk fan, and that's dreadful. And if that was my child, I would be absolutely fuming. But I think we sometimes have to be a bit careful not to be too hysterical and assume that that's happening in every row, in every stand. There's got to be a bit of perspective to this. But it is a concern. It's made the news, and it's an ongoing thing. So let's see if this makes a difference. I suspect people might just get more drinks when they go to the bar to account for that.
That is certainly one way around it, for sure. Yeah, that's and what's is that 8.6% technically with 2 pints? Then I'm not sure how that works, but yeah, it does. If you catastrophize it too much, you just have this image of the Principality Stadium full of middle-aged men projectile vomiting on the nearest available child, which is, let's face it, a little bit funny. So these things sometimes get blown out of proportion. Like on the back pages, which is where we probably should be starting. You got Johnny Sexton's quotes being carried here in Wales. Sexton's stress warning for Irish, that's the back of the South Wales Echo, and then the back of the Western Mail. We must deal with stress of playing Pivek's Wales. So Ireland skipper Johnny Sexton has warned his side to deal with the stress of playing his side, and he's noticed how Pivek has changed Wales' style since taking over from Gatland, and says that they'll need to deal with the attacking system that can stress you. Is that an accurate representation of Wales over the last little while?
Yeah, I think so. Wayne Pivek is probably a more cerebral coach than Warren Gatland, and you'll know that from watching him, when he was in charge of the Scarlets. And I always think back to that 2017 final against Munster, where Munster were heavily fancied at the Aviva Stadium. They had a bigger pack, and people, I think, thought it was going to be a bit of a grind. And it even was raining on the morning of that game, I remember, which would have favoured Munster even more. But the Scarlets came out and played that brand of rugby which just blew Munster off the park, and they weren't afraid to play and to go wide early, and I think it kind of almost revolutionised the way we thought about rugby again in Wales. And Wayne Pivek's definitely trying to take that approach to Wales, but as he always said with the Scarlets, it took him 2 or 3 seasons to almost recalibrate the way those players thought about playing, and some players, they didn't make the grade, and you saw certain players being cast aside early in his tenure. And people often forget as well, they lost the first 3 games in a row of that championship winning season. So it was a work in progress, and I think we're seeing that with Wales. So you get signs of a fairly swift progress, and then maybe a bit of a dip, as we saw in the Autumn Nations Cup 2020, where things just didn't go remotely Wales's way. And then in the championship last season, we started to see the fruits of it again. And you see locks like Alan Wynne-Jones and Jake Baldwin, who's still here, standing in the wide channels, which you'd never have seen before. Utilising forwards like that in those 15-metre tram lines. So I think there's definitely an ambition. Stephen Jones is his trusty lieutenant who was with him at the Scarlets. He's a very, an architect of attacking rugby. But as you know, you can only do that with a steady supply of ball, and if the defence is up in your face, as Ireland's usually is, then all that ambition can be squashed. So it's a balance. I think Sexton's being very diplomatic, playing at Wales' strengths. Those strengths exist. It's just whether or not we'll be able to see them in action at a vociferous Aviva Stadium against an Ireland side that are clearly just absolutely overloaded with ambition right now.
There's certainly a lot of positivity around the team. I think there's also a little bit of caution because of what happened last year. It's interesting though, like looking at Sexton, and I guess that the conversation around Sexton in Ireland is constantly how many more years does he have left, and all of a sudden he comes back and plays another couple of years and he's still at that level, and it's just rinse and repeat with that. Is that the exact same conversation that you guys have around Alan Wynne-Jones? Because I've certainly picked up on a bit of it in the papers, that it's like they hark back to moments a couple of years ago where everyone thought he was done. It was the Rugby World Cup. It was reported in the Echo in the Six Nations preview that a journalist, I think they probably pointed to it being a non-Welsh journalist, asked Alan Wynne-Jones before the semi-final, how does it feel that your last game is going to be against like in a World Cup semi-final? How does that feel before they actually played it? Which didn't go down too well. But again, a couple of years later, we're still here, and while injured, he's still playing. So is it identical to the Sexton situation, where it's like stop writing this guy off, basically?
Definitely. They're a similar age, similar talismanic status, and there just seems to be a sense in Wales that as long as Alan Wynne's around, everything will be all right. So when it was announced that he was going to miss the tournament, we already had the likes of Justin Tipuric on the sidelines, Faletau missing a good chunk of it as well. Josh Navidi not there. A lot of those talismanic forwards, Lions, but he was considered the biggest miss of all. I think he's 36 now, same age as Johnny Sexton, right? So I think Wales has to start considering a future without him. He made that miraculous comeback for the Lions, which was straight out of the Alan Wynne copybook. Completely rule him out, and then all of a sudden, people are talking about him being ready for the first test, and you're like, "What? How on earth could that happen?" So don't be surprised. Don't be remotely surprised if he pops up in round 3 of the Six Nations. And he's the kind of guy that doesn't seem to need a run of games. I mean, that might change the older he's getting now, but he's had injury layoffs before, and then he seems to come back at 9 out of 10. He doesn't take 3 or 4 games to rediscover his rhythm. But time is against him. And I think, Wales as a nation sometimes has a tendency to cling on to their heroes. Warren Gatland was the most ruthless selector I think Wales have ever had. Adam Jones, gone. Mike Phillips, gone. Jamie Roberts, stranded on 94 caps. Sentiment did not come into his selection at all. And I wonder if Warren Gatland was still here, might he have thought, do you know what? We need to think for the future. We need to groom the next Alan Wynne-Jones. It's time to move him on. I think Wayne Pivac is holding on to him because of that status he holds and because of all the other injuries. You've got to keep him involved. You've got to keep him in camp, even if it's just as a voice of experience, someone to drag these youngsters through to the next generation. I can see him going into coaching. Yeah. So it may just be a very sensible move to keep him in camp and make that transition as smooth as possible.
Yeah, straight in with the Welsh camp.
It's happened, isn't it? It happened with Sam Warburton. Didn't work out with Sam. It wasn't for him. But he went straight into national coaching, without going through the usual route of getting his badges. Gethin Jenkins is another. He'd had a bit more experience coaching at Cardiff, but he was thrust into the role when Byron Hayward left. So Wales and the Pivac administration doesn't seem concerned about whether they have to serve an apprenticeship at regional level or maybe in another country. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if Alan Wynne was kind of co-opted into that coaching setup.
What's the biggest curveball you expect from the Wales team this weekend in terms of selection?
I suppose the biggest curveball could be in the midfield. There's been a lot of chat around Josh Adams at 13. We were meant to see it against Fiji in the autumn, but he pulled up in the warm-up, so we didn't see that happen. He cameoed there against Toulouse, but that was only because Cardiff had 42 players sitting in a hotel in South Africa, so it was kind of a needs-must scenario then. So that's been spoken about because Willis Halaholoh's got a hamstring injury, and depending on who you speak to, it's more serious or less serious. Some people are saying he's almost ready to go. If that's the case, I think I'd like to see Willis Halaholohn in the midfield because Josh Adams, as good a player he is, he's untested there. Going up against Ringrose and Aki or Henshaw in the Aviva Stadium, that's probably not the place to make your first international start in a position you're not familiar with. And as you know, defensively, 13s have got to be absolutely on the money. So that I think would be the biggest curveball because you've got other centres in the squad. You've got an Owen Watkin who not many people are talking about. You've got a Nick Tompkins. So that I think would be the biggest curveball. Perhaps another would be whether or not someone like Jack Morgan gets a look in, who has been left out of the last couple of Pivac squads, even though he's been the form back row in Wales. He's in now, and there are a fair few back rowers sitting on the sidelines. So it would be a big call to thrust someone like him in on his debut in the Aviva Stadium. But, you watch him for the Ospreys, his appetite for work, his tackle count, his turnover effectiveness, and his leadership. He's been an under-20s captain, and although he's a young kid, he's pretty vocal on the pitch as well. So that will be a curveball, but I don't see it happening.
Well, what's going to be interesting over the course of the next little while is, I suppose Six Nations is often hampered by the weather, but the trend in the Northern Hemisphere has been towards a really attractive style of rugby, and I guess what Andy Farrell has proved with Ireland is that they can do that over the next little while. That would be the intention with Pivac, obviously, with Wales. Andy Dunn was on Monday Night Rugby with us this week, Kind of tongue-in-cheek saying, well, Schmidt's in with the All Blacks now, so wait for them to, put it up the jumper and win the next World Cup that way. How do you see the Six Nations developing stylistically over the next little while? Are we in for a real treat if you're a neutral bystander?
I think it has to go in that direction. We saw glimpses of the New England in the autumn. I remember speaking to Wayne before the last Six Nations, and while he had the utmost respect for the achievements of his predecessor, Warren Gatland, the stats don't lie, and Wales's record against the Southern Hemisphere Big Three was pitiful. The wins were very sporadic. Still haven't been the All Blacks since 1953 when TV was still black and white. The Wallabies beat Wales 10 times in a row under Warren Gatland. Admittedly, most of them were agonising last-minute defeats by a point or a couple of points. South Africa, a little bit different, because Wales and Warren Gatland played a similar type of game to South Africa. But what Pivac said from the very beginning was, you can't consistently beat the Southern Hemisphere teams playing that way. Therefore, you can't win a World Cup, because you'll face at least one of them, probably two or three, en route to a final. So I think Wayne Pivac is determined to expand the way Wales play, and as you say, it's a kind of trend in the game at the moment as well. Smaller players lighter on their feet, a commitment to playing more rugby. These tweaks in the laws have helped. I think we haven't seen loads of 50-22s, but they're creeping into the game. It is making defences sit a little bit further back, creating a bit more space. Ireland under Farrell, they're very physical, very abrasive, but a little less prescribed than Joe Schmidt. And
a lot less prescribed, I would say.
Prescribed. I've been polite. And France, I know we're all getting excited about France. I worked on the the coverage of the France-New Zealand game in the autumn, and it was just phenomenal. It was one of those. I think we had half an hour off air, but because it was on Amazon Prime, we could just extend that, because unlike when you're on the BBC, Gardeners World isn't coming up next. You don't have to meet your time slot. So it was one of those ones where the producers just came through and said, "I'm ripping up the running order. Let's just milk this. Let's chat." We had Serge Betson with us, Nick Evans, and it was just an absolute pleasure. We were back and forth to Paris, bringing all the interviews in, and it was just a brilliant rugby occasion. The kind of thing all us neutrals crave. Untermack running from his own try line, just phenomenal. So I think Galtier has instilled that Gallic elan back into the French game, and they're the favourites for obvious reasons. In answer to your question, I hope, as the sun peeks out from behind the clouds here in North Cardiff, we could be in for an absolute treat. We need it, don't we? After the last couple of years of misery and despair, not in rugby, just in the world at large.
No, rugby, misery and despair from a Welsh perspective didn't exist last year, but from Irish perspective, I guess there was plenty of that to go around.
Yeah.
Just the one thing that you mentioned there is obviously the World Cup, and when we were chatting about Wales on the show the other day, we'd a few Welsh commenters saying, well, come back to us when you've won a Rugby World Cup quarter final, and they have a point. Ireland have never won a Rugby World Cup quarter final, but do Wales obsess with the World Cup in the same way, with the sort of near misses that they've had? I know it's been at a later stage, always. Yeah. Semi-finals, that must be an amazing feeling, actually getting to a semi-final. But is there that sense that you're thinking about 2023 in every sort of sense when you're watching these games over the next few weeks?
I think there's probably more of a focus on the Six Nations in Wales than perhaps some of the other nations. You always get the sense from England, don't you, that it's all about the cycle. Yeah. And people are talking about the England side at the moment. Eddie Jones has got rid of the Vunipolas, he's got rid of a couple of his stalwarts, and he's looking to blood a new generation. Wayne Pivac has tended to do that in the autumn. The Autumn Nations Cup, I think he gave 14 new caps out. And similarly, this autumn gone by, he's experimented. Over the course of his tenure, he's had 12 different centre partnerships. I get the impression with Wales, they still see the Six Nations as a means to an end. We want to win this tournament. It's the biggest annual rugby tournament in the world. It shouldn't be seen as a rung on the ladder to a World Cup. That said, I think everyone thinks in cycles now, so there's always an eye on the World Cup. With regard to Wales, I think even though since 2011 they got to another quarter-final, they got to another semi-final, it's the 2011 one that still stings. That it was bizarre. It came out of nowhere, and all of a sudden, the stars seemed to be aligning. Ireland beating Australia was a big deal because that sort of opened a path, I think, for Wales. And
we thought the same about Wales being there in the quarter-final, I must say.
But genuinely, there was a feeling like nothing I've ever witnessed. Like my dad, who would rather watch the game in his living room than even go to the pub at the end of his road, was ringing me up going, should we book tickets to New Zealand? Wow. It was a once-in-a-generation thing, and people were thinking, we're going to win this. We're going to win the World Cup. In 2015, I think Wales kind of limped into that quarter-final, and although perhaps should have beaten South Africa, there was a feeling that the injuries had taken such a hold that they'd have collapsed against the All Blacks. And likewise, in 2019, even though it was another agonisingly close one, I don't think there was that same surge of optimism. Every time Wales got a round deeper, there was a feeling that we're riding our luck here. They didn't play well in the pool stages. Whereas in 2011, shouldn't have had a man sent off. Lost Adam Jones before Sam Warburton went off. I say shouldn't have had a man sent off. It was a red card, but you know what I mean. But there was this feeling that New Zealand in the final bottled it. Yeah. France should have won that game. Really should have, yeah. And there's a feeling that had Wales got there, they'd have done it. So I think we're as haunted by World Cup memories as Ireland are, just perhaps in a different way.
Yeah. Maybe the quarter-final is just kind of far enough away from the final for us to get too haunted by it. It's just a nice sort of, it's like, we wouldn't have won it anyway, so who cares? Quarter-final, semi-final, exactly. Tomato. If you're looking at this Wales squad now, I think the general sense is that I think you would be surprised if they won the Six Nations this year. Would I be right in saying that? So this squad then, are you looking at that and thinking to yourself, there's something at play here for 2023 that in 18 months' time I could look at those players that are coming through in this year's Six Nations, and that's going to be a little bit of short-term pain for long-term gain?
Yeah, there's definitely an element of that, I think. But then, as I say, I don't like the Six Nations being reduced to a rung on the ladder to the World Cup. So I do like, whether it's as a punter or as a professional, I like to look at the Six Nations as a self-contained tournament that everyone should look to win. You're right. There is a much lower level of optimism in Wales, given the injuries, given the form of the regions. But in many ways, that was ever thus. The regions have rarely ever played brilliantly in the lead up to a Six Nations. But Warren Gatland almost had that alchemist's touch. They'd be in camp for 2 weeks. He famously used to play mind games with them, where he'd insist to them that no one was training as hard, no one was running as fast, no one was lifting as heavy weights. And it was all nonsense, or at least it could have been all nonsense. He wasn't basing that on anything. But he got into the Welsh players' heads, and he persuaded them that they were bigger, faster, stronger than any of their opponents. And psychologically, that took root. So there's always been that strange idea that you go to that Vela Glamorgan hotel where Wales base themselves, and it's like stepping through a portal. I think Donald O'Callaghan put it best, didn't he, when he said, it's like they go from Clark Kent to Superman. Like they'll suddenly rip away their regional shirt and the Wales emblem comes out, and they become 10, 20, 30% better. I'm not sure whether that was specifically a Gatland thing or whether it's a Wales thing and a Vela Glamorgan thing, because as we mentioned earlier, Wayne Pivac's game plan is probably a little bit more complex. And therefore, is it as easy to transition from one to the other as... Warren Gatland would hate me for saying this because it used to irk him that people considered his game plan to be simplistic or one-dimensional. But I think it was probably easier for that Wales squad under Gatland that had been together for 10 years to just slot back into Wales mode, whereas it's a different regime now. But yeah, I think that you look at the bookies. I think I saw the other day Wales are 25-1 for a Grand Slam, and 12 months ago they came within a missed tackle of a Grand Slam, and no one was giving them a chance then either. So, while I'm not, as a Welshman, hugely confident, I've seen this happen before. Yeah. Momentum, it's a cliche, but momentum is so critical in the Six Nations. You win one, your chest puffs out a bit more. You win another, you start thinking about the maths and the fixture list. I think not the only thing, but the big thing that counts against Wales this time is the start. Ireland in Dublin. Wales haven't won this since 2012. That is not an easy start. To have a home game to begin with against an opponent you're more fancied against, then that momentum can develop. So I think it's going to be a tall order for Wales in Dublin, but it's happened before.
Yeah. Is it going to happen this weekend? 6-1 was the prices we saw last week. You're surely putting money on that, are you, from a Welsh perspective?
I'm not a gambling man, Eoin. I like to look at the odds just to inform my own opinions, but I just look at the provinces, and I know it doesn't always translate. So in the same way that the Welsh regional form doesn't always translate into brilliant national form, the amazing Irish provincial form doesn't always translate into test form.
You're forgetting the Cardiff Blues and their amazing win against Leinster last week.
Cardiff Rugby, I should say.
Oh, sorry, I'm getting caught up here in 2013.
Yeah, it's very political. Well, exactly, 28-0 against Toulouse. You can't fault that, can you? Amazing result. Away as well. But then I just look at... I know some of those scorelines were skewed, but those consecutive weekends where Leinster put 80 on Montpellier and then 60 on Bath, and I look at that, the personnel in that Leinster side and the amount of overlap with the Irish side. I look at the coaching staff. It pains me to say it, but I think if Wales get within 2 scores, it'll probably be a moral victory of sorts.
Right. Okay. So if you had to put a scoreline on it,
I would probably say Ireland by 12.
I think that is around what the bookies are saying as well. Ross, it's been great catching up with you. Apologies for my colleagues back in Dublin for writing off Wales. I mean, an absolute disgrace. Do you have any message to them before we go? I mean, the shock jocks back in Dublin.
Whatever happened to the Celtic Brotherhood is what I'd like to say. We used to have the Ireland players' backs, and we hoped you had ours. Clearly not the case anymore. So we'll see you in Dublin on Saturday. But Guinness all round, whatever the result is, it or Murphy's.
Well, don't be drinking the 5% Heineken because it causes you to vomit everywhere, apparently. So we'll see you there, Ross Harries of a load of different things. Check out his work. You can check him out on Twitter. You'll see him on TV very shortly. Indeed, I presume you're working around a game on Saturday as well, are you?
I'm not actually on Saturday. I'm watching it as a punter. Right. So I'll be enjoying myself without all the pressure of work that comes with it.
Good stuff. Well, enjoy that, and thanks a million for sitting down for a chat today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Cheers.